The horse had learned in 4 years of war to trust no one. He was 17 hands of dark iron, a gelding the color of river silt in November with a white blaze splitting his face like a fault line and one white fetlock on the near side fore. He had carried Lord Ashmore through the assault at Salamanca and stood unmoved while the guns shook the ground. He had been grazed twice along the neck and had not flinched. Men who approached him without permission found themselves introduced to his front teeth. The grooms at Ashmore Park had a private name for him, spoken below the level of the house. He was called Grief. The guests did not know this. They arrived in carriages and post-chaises on the 3rd Saturday of October, in the first proper chill of the autumn of 1816, and several of the gentlemen went directly to the stable-yard as gentlemen do when they wish to admire another man's blood and his good fortune. The horse pinned his ears and showed his teeth, and Lord Cranworth stepped back into a mounting block, and very nearly fell, and the story was all over the drawing-room before the second course of dinner. Philippa Crane heard it from the doorway. She had not been invited to stand in doorways. She had been engaged at Ashmore Park as nurse to his lordship's ward, a girl of 7 named Clara, who had come to the estate from a dead sister's household in June, and had not yet learned to eat enough, or to trust any voice that raised itself above a murmur. Philippa was 24 years old, the daughter of a country surgeon who had left her a modest education and very little else, and she had taken the position at Ashmore Park because it paid tolerably, and because the advertisement had not required references from a great house, only from a physician, and her father's old colleague had been willing to write one. She had been here 6 weeks. She did not have occasion to be in the drawing-room, except when she was passing through it with Clara, and she was not passing through it now. She was standing in the servants' corridor with a tray of warm milk and toast, soldiers that Clara had finally consented to eat, and the latch of the corridor door was not quite closed, and she could hear everything. Lord Ashmore himself said nothing about the horse. She had seen him twice in 6 weeks, which was once more than she had expected. The first time was in the entrance hall on the day she arrived, when he had appeared at the top of the stairs to assess the new appointment, and she had looked up and found a man of perhaps 32 or 33, very dark, with the particular stillness of someone who has disciplined himself out of any obvious movement. He wore a plain, dark coat and no decoration, and there was nothing performative about his presence, which was, perhaps, why it was so considerable. He had looked at her for 3 seconds, and then said to his housekeeper that she should see Miss Crane's things to the upper passage-room, and he had gone. The second time was across the kitchen garden, where she had been walking with Clara in the pale October light, and he had come around the corner on a path he clearly used alone, and stopped, and looked at the child, and then at Philippa, and said, in a voice she could not read at all, that Clara had more color than she had in September. Then he had continued on his way. She had thought about that sentence for 2 days before she understood what it cost him to have said it. The guests were here for the shooting. To the drawing-room, Philippa Crane was not anything. She was the nurse upstairs, if she was considered at all. Women like Lady Harcastle knew that there was a nurse for the ward, and did not require further information. Lord Cranworth had not noticed her when she brought Clara through the hall. Only Clara noticed her, and Clara noticed her, the way children notice the only fixed point in a room that has begun to tilt. If you have ever found yourself in a house where you are necessary but not seen, you understand something of what the next 3 weeks were for Philippa. Let that settle for a moment. Then we will continue. She did not resent the invisibility. She had been training for it all her life, in the way that daughters of men who could not afford to keep them train for nothing else. She was neat and plain and useful, and she kept herself at a precise distance from every situation that did not concern her. She wore gray, and moved quietly, and did her work well, and asked for nothing that she had not been given. She was not the kind of woman who pressed against the glass of other people's lives. It was the horse who undid this arrangement. On the 4th morning of the shooting party, Philippa rose early to walk Clara before the cold deepened, and she took the child through the kitchen garden and into the near paddock by the oak walk, because it was quiet there, and Clara liked the sound of the crows in the upper branches. The horse was at the fence line. He should not have been in that paddock. He was stabled as a rule in the stone block at the far end of the yard, and his door was locked in the evenings because one of the younger grooms had made the mistake of leaving it unlatched, and the horse had spent 4 hours in the night yard in August, doing nothing in particular but making himself impossible to retrieve without incident. Philippa did not know any of this. She saw a large, dark horse at a fence rail, and she thought in her practical surgeon's daughter way that the animal looked uncomfortable. There was mud on his near side leg, and he was standing slightly wrong, taking a fraction more weight on his offside. Clara stopped walking. "He bites," Clara said. It was one of her longer sentences. "He may," Philippa said. "Let us see." She walked to within 6 feet and stood still. The horse lifted his head and looked at her. He had dark eyes, very clear, and the white blaze made his face look divided between 2 opinions. His ears were not pinned. They moved, questioning. She did not reach for him. She did not make a sound. She simply waited. He lowered his head and took 1 step toward the fence. "He did not bite," Clara said. "Not yet," Philippa said. She spoke to him after a moment in a low, uninflected voice. The kind of voice she used with children who were wary of new rooms. She did not tell him he was handsome or clever or good. She told him that his near leg was bothering him, and that she could see it, and that she was not going to pretend otherwise. He stood and listened to this with his ears half forward and his breath visible in the October air. And when she finally held her hand flat at the rail, he pressed his nose into her palm for 3 seconds, and then stepped back. She walked around to the gate, let herself in, and examined the near fetlock. There was heat in the pastern, a stone bruise most likely, or the beginning of one. She told him what she was doing at each step, and he turned his head, and watched her with 1 dark eye, and at no point did he attempt to bite her. Clara watched from outside the gate, her small hands wrapped around the lowest rail, her chin on her wrists. Lord Ashmore saw it from the oak walk. He had come out in the early morning, as he often did, to avoid the noise of a house full of guests in its waking hours. He had fought for 3 years in the peninsula, and the noise of several cheerful voices, in an enclosed space, still sometimes produced in him a sensation like a key being turned in a lock he could not open. He walked in the mornings before the house assembled. He came through the oak walk, and he saw through the bars of the October light, his horse standing quiet at the fence, while a woman in a gray cloak examined its leg. He stopped. He stood at the edge of the trees for perhaps 5 minutes, watching. The woman spoke. The horse listened. The child stood at a careful distance outside the gate and watched both of them with the particular gravity of a child who has learned that adults behave strangely near large animals and that it is wiser not to interfere. Lord Ashmore watched the horse's ears, which told him what the animal was thinking with more reliability than most people managed. The ears said that the horse was not merely tolerating this. The ears said that the horse had decided something, and whatever it had decided was the opposite of what it had decided. About Lord Cranworth and the mounting block, he considered what kind of person could do this. He did not reach any immediate conclusion, but the question stayed with him in the way certain questions do. He continued to the fence when she had finished, and was letting herself out of the gate. "Miss Crane," he said. She startled less than he expected. She had, he thought, the kind of composure that comes from practice, rather than from temperament. She had been startled before, and she had learned from it. "My lord," she said, "he does not permit that." "He permitted it today," she said, and she met his eyes steadily for a moment, not in challenge, only in statement, and then she looked at the horse. "His near pastern is warm. I would not put weight on him for 3 days at least. He may have struck something on the stones." He looked at the fetlock himself, moving to the gate without ceremony, and the horse allowed this as it always did, because the horse and the Earl of Ashmore understood each other in the specific way of 2 creatures who had been in the same war. He ran his hand down the leg and confirmed what she said, and he straightened and looked at her. "How did you know to approach him that way?" "My father kept a horse," she said. He was not a difficult horse, but he was particular about people. You could not approach him with any agenda. He knew immediately if you had one. He looked at Clara, who was watching him with the specific gravity she reserved for his appearances. "Are you eating better, Clara?" he said. "Some," Clara said. It was. Philippa registered the longest exchange she had witnessed between them. The shooting party lasted 5 days more, and each morning Philippa walked the near paddock before the house was properly awake, and each morning the horse came to the fence rail without invitation. She brought him nothing, offered no particular blandishment, only stood and spoke to him in her low, practical voice about his leg, and the weather and whatever Clara had said at breakfast. He pushed his nose at her shoulder and stood with his ears half forward. The head groom, a taciturn Scotsman named Drummond, watched this from the stable yard with the expression of a man who has been proven wrong about something and is not entirely sure how to frame it. On the third morning he brought her a carrot without being asked, and set it on the fence post and went back to his work. On the morning of the 6th day, Lady Harcastle saw her. Lady Harcastle was the most important woman in the room at any gathering she attended, not because she was titled above the others, but because she had the particular confidence of a woman whose social categories had never failed her. She was 53 years old, and she had been managing the opinions of other people since before Philippa's father had qualified. She was Lord Ashmore's nearest neighbor, and she had decided, years before the shooting party, that the house at Ashmore Park would make an excellent match for her niece, Miss Elspeth Vane, who was everything one could wish. Miss Vane was very pretty, very polished, admirably connected, with dark red hair dressed in the current fashion and a composed manner that never spilled into any register more demonstrative than serene. To the season, she was exactly the sort of girl who was supposed to marry well, and Lady Harcastle was exactly the sort of woman who made sure that things that were supposed to happen did happen. She had arranged the shooting party by writing to Lord Ashmore twice in August, which had the effect of producing an invitation that he was too courteous to withhold. She had observed over the course of it that he was polite and attentive to Miss Vane in the way that a well-bred man is polite and attentive to a guest, and she had been taking careful note of whether there was anything more than politeness in it, and she had not yet decided. She came through the garden in her walking dress and pelisse, because she also rose early, and she saw the nurse standing at the paddock fence talking to the Earl's horse, and she saw the Earl arriving from the oak walk and stopping to speak to the nurse, and she saw the way that the nurse did not curtsy a second time when he arrived, only turned to him with a directness that was entirely improper for a woman in her position, and she saw the way the horse put its head between them, and she recorded all of it with the precision of a woman who keeps very accurate accounts of the world around her. At dinner that evening, Lady Harcastle said, in the pleasant tone she reserved for information she wished to disseminate without appearing to be doing so, that she understood the new nurse was something of a horsewoman. She addressed this to Lord Cranworth, but she angled it at the table. Lord Ashmore did not look up from his plate. "I understand," Lady Harcastle continued, "that she has made quite a fixture of that difficult horse of yours, Ashmore, the one that put Cranworth into the mounting block. You will not mind my saying it is somewhat unconventional for a nurse." "I mind very little that is useful," Lord Ashmore said, which was not a reply to what she had said, exactly, which the table heard as one thing, and Philippa, carrying Clara up the back stairs at that hour, would never know had been said at all. Miss Elspeth Vane, seated to Lord Ashmore's left, smiled and changed the subject with the practiced grace of a woman who has been trained to smooth social surfaces. She spoke about the county and the autumn weather and a concert she had attended in September, and she did it very well, and the table moved on. Lady Harcastle had made her point all the same, and the point had been understood by at least 4 people at the table, and it was one of those points that does not need to be discussed further to continue working. The shooting party ended. The guests departed in their carriages, and Lord Cranworth shook Lord Ashmore's hand and said it had been excellent, and Lady Harcastle pressed his hand between both of hers, and said she hoped they would see more of him before Christmas, and Miss Vane descended the steps in a pale blue carriage dress, the exact color of the November sky, saying all the right things in all the right proportions, and the carriages went down the drive and Ashmore Park subsided into its quieter self. It was during this quieter period that Philippa learned the story of the horse. She did not learn it from Lord Ashmore. She learned it from Drummond, who had decided that a woman his horse liked could probably be trusted with most things, and who told her one gray morning while she was helping him check the fetlock, which was improving steadily. The horse had gone to the peninsula, with Lord Ashmore as a 4-year-old. He had been there for the whole of it, the crossing and the march and Salamanca and Vittoria and all the other occasions, with names that meant something to soldiers and nothing to people at home. He had carried Lord Ashmore's younger brother for 6 months, when Lord Ashmore had taken a fever and his brother Nathaniel had ridden in his place. Nathaniel Ashmore had died at Toulouse in 1814, not of a wound taken in battle, but of a fever that came after, the kind that takes a man in a matter of days and leaves nothing explanatory behind. He had been 21 years old. He had been, Drummond said, looking at the horse's neck rather than at Philippa, the sort of man who made other men glad to know him. The horse had been led home by a corporal who did not understand why the animal was refusing to leave the place where it had last seen its rider, until the second day of trying. Drummond told this without ceremony, stroking the horse's neck in the way of a man who has been telling the same story to himself for 2 years and has worn it smooth. He does not dislike people, Drummond said. He dislikes people who do not see him clearly. Philippa said nothing. She finished with the leg and stood up and looked at the horse, who looked back at her with one dark eye. "Lord Ashmore," she said. "His brother." "Aye," Drummond said. "Ah!" That is the shape of it. She did not tell anyone what she had learned. She carried it the way she carried most things that she understood and could not fix. She walked the near paddock in the mornings, and the horse came to the fence, and she told him in her low, practical voice that she was sorry about Nathaniel, and he pushed his nose at her shoulder, and she stood with her hand on his neck and let the November cold do what it did. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the shooting party, when she found Lord Ashmore at the fence before her. He was standing at the rail with his hands in his coat pockets, and the horse beside him, both of them looking at the frost on the grass, with the particular shared silence of two creatures who have run out of words for something and have agreed to stop trying. He did not turn when she arrived, because he had heard her on the path. She stopped a few paces away and considered withdrawing, and then she considered that she had as much right to the paddock as anyone, and continued to the rail. "He is better," she said. "Yes," Lord Ashmore said. "Drummond tells me it was your diagnosis. A stone bruise requires no great diagnostic skill." "No," he said. "But standing in a paddock with a horse that has put 3 grooms in the midden requires something." She was quiet. The horse moved to put his head between them in that way. He had not seeking attention exactly, only making the point of his presence felt. "Miss Crane," Lord Ashmore said. He was looking at the frost still. "And de Sèvres. Why did you not flinch when he came at you? The first time, when you were at the gate." "He was not coming at me," she said. "He was investigating. Most people cannot tell the difference." "I can tell the difference," she said, "because I have known people who investigated and people who attacked, and they do not move the same way." He turned his head and looked at her. Then, for the second long time in her experience of him, and she held the look without stepping back from it or stepping toward it, which seemed to be all he required because he looked away again and said, after a moment, that Clara was eating more. "She is," Philippa said. "You have done that." "She has done it," Philippa said. "I have only kept turning up." Something shifted in his face, very slightly. Not a smile. Not quite. But the line of his jaw softened by a degree that she noticed because she had been watching him with the same attention she gave to everything that interested her and trying to pretend she was not. He stayed at the fence for another 10 minutes, and neither of them spoke again in that time, but neither of them left, and the horse stood between them breathing visible clouds in the cold air, and when he finally turned to go he paused and said, not quite looking at her, that if she wished to exercise the horse when the leg had fully mended, Drummond would see to the tack. She thanked him. He walked away through the frost. She stood at the rail for a moment longer, with the horse's breath warm at her ear and the silence of the estate pressing down around her, and she told herself very firmly that she was a nurse in a situation, and that the Earl of Ashmore was her employer. The horse pressed his nose at her jaw. "Hush," she told him, though he had said nothing. Lady Hardcastle returned to Ashmore Park in November with the stated purpose of a morning call and the actual purpose of assessment. She brought Miss Vane. They were received in the drawing-room, and Lord Ashmore sat in the chair by the window and was perfectly courteous in the particular way of a man who has learned courtesy as a foreign language and speaks it correctly without an accent. Miss Vane was charming and gracious and said several intelligent things about the neighborhood, about a book she had been reading, about the condition of the Pemberton Road. Lady Hardcastle spoke at some length about a ball being given by the Pemberton family in December, and how very welcome Lord Ashmore would be, and how gratifying it was when a man of his standing could be persuaded out of the country in the winter months. She watched his face while she said this. His face gave her very little. She was accustomed to difficult men, and she filed the difficulty away. He said he would see what could be arranged, which she recorded as encouragement. Philippa was not in the drawing-room. She was in the schoolroom with Clara, listening to the sound of the carriage below, through the window which was open a crack for the air. "She is very pretty," Clara said, looking out at Miss Vane descending to the gravel. "Yes," Philippa said. "Will she marry Lord Ashmore?" Philippa set down the primer she had been holding. "I do not know." "Drummond says the horse does not like her," Clara said. "The horse stamped when her carriage went past." "The horse does not like most people," Philippa said. "That is not a sufficient basis for anything." Clara considered this with the gravity. She brought to all conclusions. "He likes you," she said. "Yes," Philippa said. "He does." She did not say anything else, and she did not look out the window again, and she returned to the primer with a deliberateness that Clara, who noticed most things, quietly noted. The Pemberton ball was in the 3rd week of December, and Lord Ashmore went. Philippa knew this because the house prepared for it in the ways that houses prepare for the absence of their masters, a particular quality of settling into its own rhythms, that she found, if she was honest, easier to inhabit. She put Clara to bed early, and sat by the fire in her small room, and read until she was tired, and she was reading when she heard the carriage return in the early hours, and the sound of his boots on the gravel, and then the house doors closing, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she had been listening, and that the acknowledgment sat uncomfortably in her chest. She extinguished her candle and lay in the dark for some time before she slept. He came home changed, in some ways she could not immediately name. She saw it the next morning. She was in the kitchen garden cutting the last of the winter herbs, when he came through, later than his usual hour, and he stopped and stood at the corner of the boxwood, and looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not warmth. Exactly. It was more like a decision being approached from the outside, by a man who has been circling it for some time and has arrived at its perimeter and is examining the ground. "Miss Crane," he said. "My lord," she said. She had a bundle of sage in her hand. "Lady Hardcastle informs me that you were previously employed in a house in Suffolk," he said. She was still. "I was," she said, "for 8 months before this appointment." "She tells me," he said, and his voice was level, giving nothing, "that you left that position under some degree of difficulty. The cold came at her from 2 directions. She kept her hands steady, which cost her something. I left that position," she said, "because the master of the house made it clear that my continued employment depended on my willingness to be of service in ways that were outside my duties. I refused. I was given a reference that described me as unsuitable." She paused. "Lady Hardcastle has been thorough." He was watching her. She could not read him as usual, but she had learned to wait. "She suggested," he said, "that I ought to know?" "She wished to remove me," Philippa said. "That is understandable. I am inconvenient to her purpose here." She looked down at the sage in her hands and then back at him. "I will pack, if you require it." "I do not require it," he said. She looked up. "The man in Suffolk," he said. He did not finish the sentence, but the way he left it told her that he had understood precisely what she meant, and that he had a view of it, and that his view was not Lady Harcastle's view, and that in fact it was the view of a man who had decided something at a Pemberton ball and had come directly to the kitchen garden the following morning to act on it. "He faced no consequence," she said. "No," Lord Ashmore said. "They rarely do." He stood for a moment longer, his hands in his coat pockets, and she was aware of him the way she was always aware of the horse, in that complete way that takes in more than one sense at a time. The specific quality of his stillness and the color of his coat against the gray stone of the garden wall and the breath that was visible in the cold air between them. "The horse needs exercise," he said, "if you are willing." She was willing. They rode twice a week through December, he on a bay gelding from the stable and she on the war horse, who moved for her with a long, easy stride. He did not offer anyone else. They did not speak a great deal, which suited them both. They rode along the estate's carriage drives and through the field paths, and once when the frost was hard and the air was very clear, out onto the downs, and she could see, in the distance, the gray line of the sea. He told her on one of these rides about Nathaniel. Not much. He was not a man who told things in quantity. He said his brother's name in a sentence that was not otherwise about his brother, and she heard the weight in it, the specific gravity of a name that has not been spoken aloud for a long time in company other than silence. She said simply that she was sorry, and he was quiet for several seconds, looking at the path ahead. And then he said that his brother had been the sort of person who found the best in most situations, and that he had not been able to work out how to be in the world without that particular quality attending him. "You are managing," she said. "I observe you managing." "Yes," he said. "It does not feel sufficient." "It is sufficient," she said, "for the people who depend on it." He looked at her. She was watching the path ahead, and she was aware of him looking, but she did not turn. "Clara," he said. "Clara, and the horse, and Drummond, and this house." She paused. "You carry more than you acknowledge." He said nothing for a long time after that. They rode in silence through the frost and the quiet of the December fields, and she felt her own heart turning something over in the way it did, when she was in the presence of something true and large and not entirely safe, and she held it carefully, and did not let it show. Because she was still a woman in a situation, and she had not been given leave to be anything else. When they came back to the stable yard, the horse turned his head and pressed it briefly against her shoulder before Drummond took him, and Lord Ashmore watched this and was quiet, and went into the house. Lady Harcastle's letter arrived the morning of the 22nd of December. It was addressed to Lord Ashmore, and she had no knowledge of it until later, but she learned its contents from the way the house felt at dinner time, which was the particular stillness of a house in which something has been decided and not yet spoken. She was in the corridor with Clara's supper tray when she heard Mrs. Dand Elwood speaking to the under-butler in a low voice about preparations, and she understood that there would be company for Christmas, and that it would be Lady Harcastle and Miss Vane and several of their relations. She went to her room and lay down her book, and was honest with herself. She thought about Miss Vane in the pale blue carriage dress. She thought about what Lady Harcastle was, which was a woman whose categories worked, and about what she herself was, which was a nurse with a misleading reference, and a father who had died leaving her nothing adequate. She thought about the rides through the frost and the way he said Nathaniel's name, and the way he had stood in the kitchen garden and said that he did not require her to pack. She took each of these things in sequence and looked at them, and then she told herself that, looking at them in the light she had been looking at them, was a kind of vanity she could not afford, and that she should go to bed and sleep well and be a nurse in the morning. She did not sleep well. On the morning of the 23rd she rose early and went to the paddock before the light was properly up and stood at the rail with the cold coming in from the east and the horse at her shoulder. And she was very honest with herself about what she felt and what she could not afford to feel, and the horse stood beside her while she worked through it. And when she was finished, she pressed her forehead to his neck for a moment and then stepped back. "I know," she said. "You cannot fix it." He breathed at her ear. She turned to go, and Lord Ashmore was on the path. He had come very quietly, or she had been very occupied. He was standing at the edge of the paddock, close enough that she had nearly walked into him, and his face was doing something she had not seen before, something strained at the edges, as though several things were pressing against the inside of it, and had been doing so for longer than was comfortable. "Miss Crane," he said. "My lord." She kept her voice level. "I have read Lady Harcastle's letter," he said. "She has proposed to come for Christmas with her party. She has proposed this in terms that make it clear she considers the question of Miss Vane's position to be, if not settled, then at least settable." He paused. "I have not answered." She waited. "I am not going to answer it," he said, in the way she expects. The cold was very clear, and the morning was very quiet, and the horse had come to the fence rail without being called. "Miss Crane," he said. He said it differently the second time. "Philippa, it was the first time." She looked at him. "I do not know how to do this correctly," he said. "I am told by people who understand these things better than I do that a man in my position ought to know. I find that I do not." He stopped. He looked at the horse, who was watching him with one dark eye, steady and waiting. "He tolerates very few people. He has tolerated you since the first morning. He has in fact done considerably more than tolerate you." "He is a good judge," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "He is," Lord Ashmore said. "He has always been. He was Nathaniel's judge too. He took one step closer, not closing the distance entirely, only reducing it so that she could see the particular gray of his eyes in the cold morning light. I am asking you to stay. Not as a nurse. I am asking you to consider whether you might be willing to make this your home." The world was very still. She had trained for her whole life not to want things she could not afford to want. She had been very disciplined about it. She thought of Lady Harcastle's letter, and the polished certainty of Miss Vane's pale blue carriage dress, and the voice that had said, in a drawing-room in Suffolk, that she was unsuitable, and she looked at the man in front of her, who was asking her something in the most direct terms he possessed, which were not very ornate terms, and whose face was doing what it always did, which was to tell her nothing deliberate, and everything true. "I am not," she said slowly, "a convenient choice." "No," he said. "I have no connections that would serve you. I have a reference that is actively misleading. I have opinions about horses and children and how things ought to be done, and I do not suppress them very well." "I know," he said. "I have been observing this for 6 weeks." "Then you are making this choice with full information," she said. "I am," he said. "That is the point. I am making it with full information, which is something I did not do adequately once before, and which cost me considerably. I do not intend to do it again." She heard Nathaniel, in that the shape of his absence in a sentence not about him. "Then, yes," she said, "I will stay." He reached out his hand, bare in the morning cold, and she put hers in it, and his hand closed around hers very carefully, the way a man handles something he does not wish to break, and the horse breathed at both their shoulders, and the morning was very still, and that was all. That was all that was needed. Lady Harcastle received her letter on the 24th of December. It was courteous, as everything from Ashmore Park was courteous, and it informed her that circumstances had altered and that he would not be able to receive a party at Christmas, and that he hoped she and Miss Vane would enjoy the Pemberton festivities, and that he remained her grateful neighbor. She read it twice, and set it down, and looked at her niece and said, with the particular composure of a woman whose categories have encountered their limit, that it appeared Lord Ashmore had made other arrangements. Miss Vane received this in silence. She was not, at the end of the matter, a foolish woman. She had seen something at the paddock fence that October morning, when they had all been walking before breakfast, and she had filed it away in the place where certain information goes, when you are not ready to look at it directly. And she took it out now, and looked at it. And then she went to her room and sat by the window, with her hands in her lap for a little while, and then she rang for tea and wrote 2 letters of acceptance for the new year, and she was In the end, fine. She had not lost something she had possessed. She had not been given something. She had been promised. It was a different kind of grief, quieter than most, and she had enough sense to respect it without dramatizing it, which was, on reflection, the most intelligent thing she had done all autumn. Christmas at Ashmore Park was quiet. The dining room was not laid for 20, it was laid for 3. Philippa sat at the table she had been passing through for 2 months, now part of its geometry in a different way, and Clara sat between them and ate considerably more than she had in September, and the candles burned down slowly over the course of the evening, and the fire was very good, and outside the frost was hard and bright. At one point the horse could be heard from the stable yard producing one of his occasional opinions about something in the night yard, which made Clara laugh, which made Philippa smile, which made Lord Ashmore look at her across the table in the way he had looked at her in the frost on the path, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away. He proposed formally, on the 27th, in the library, with the particular economy of language she had come to understand as his version of tenderness. He said that he had spoken to Mr. Rodd, Ellery, his solicitor, and that the settlements would be drawn with attention to her situation, and that he would be grateful if she would consent to be his wife. He said this looking at her steadily, which was his way of saying everything he could not otherwise say, and she said yes, which was her way. And he took her hand again and held it for a longer time than was strictly necessary, and this time she leaned slightly toward him, which was as far as she was prepared to move in a library in December. And he understood this and was satisfied. In January, when the settlements were confirmed and the notice had been sent to the papers, and Mrs. Elwood had begun the quiet upheaval that a change of mistress requires of a house, Philippa went to the paddock in the early morning. The light was pale and thin, and the frost was hard, and the horse came to the fence without being called, as he always did, and she stood with her hand on his neck and was honest with herself about everything. She thought about the surgeon's house and the careful life she had kept there, and the years of managing herself into whatever space was available, and the voice that had said she was unsuitable, and the morning in Suffolk when she had understood that some things were not survivable on your own, and somehow she had survived. She thought about Clara, who was sleeping in the upper room, with more color in her face than she had had in June. She thought about the man in the library who said very little and meant most of it. She thought about what it was to be seen clearly, by something that could not be flattered into seeing what was convenient. The horse pressed his nose at her jaw. "I know," she said. She stood there in the January frost for a long time, with the estate quiet around her and the pale light coming up over the downs, and she was not managing herself into a smaller space. She was standing in the full width of what she occupied, and it was enough, and it was hers. The wedding was in February, quiet as everything else had been in the parish church at the edge of the estate. Clara was there in a white dress, which she had consented to wear after a brief negotiation. About the sash Mr. Ellery was there to witness. Mrs. Elwood was there, with her best gloves. Drummond was not there because he was with the horse, who was exercising in the paddock, and could be heard at intervals from the church path, which made the vicar pause mid-sentence and caused Clara to press her lips together in the way that meant she was not going to laugh, but it was a very near thing. Afterward they walked back through the February cold, along the estate path, and the horse was at the fence rail, and Philippa stopped and pressed her hand to his neck, and he stood with his ears forward and breathed warmth into the cold air. "Grief?" she said quietly, which was the first time she had used the name, because she had learned it from Drummond, and had never been sure it was hers to use until this morning. He pushed his head against her shoulder, which she took as permission. Lord Ashmore stood beside her, not quite touching, in the way of a man who is still learning that he is allowed to be near the things he loves without bracing for their removal. She moved her hand so that it rested against his coat sleeve, and he turned his head and looked at her. And the morning was cold and bright, and the estate was theirs, and the horse stood at the fence between them, like a benediction. Neither of them had thought to pray for. They walked back to the house when the cold became too much. Clara went ahead, slipping on the frosty path and catching herself, reaching back to take Philippa's free hand for the last few yards. The three of them went up the steps together in the February light, and the door closed behind them, and the house took on the particular warmth of a house that knows it is no longer waiting for something. The horse stayed at the fence a while longer, watching. If you found yourself moved by what quiet courage can carry, and by what sometimes after a long time it is given in return, then you already know why he stayed.